lesson of this course, finally going to talk about actual U.S. foreign policy. Thank you for waiting. The first 25 years of the American governmental experience was dominated by feuding, debating, and fine-tuning how the government was going to look. And that's fine. They had gone through a tough breakup with the revolution against the Great Britain and learning how to balance the powers of a president versus those of the state. But by the 1800s, they were ready to expand on the world stage and be a great player. So let's look at aggressive U.S. expansion during the 1800s. We'll talk about cowboys, Indians, and lawyers. This is a map that we're going to look at quite a bit in this lecture. We're going to do an overview just now, and later on we'll look in more detail. The brown part represents the country as it looked after 1783 and the breakup with Great Britain. It's really quite large. If it were a country today, it would be tied for 13th largest in the world with Saudi Arabia. Larger than Mexico. Modern day Mexico. Not old Mexico. We'll get to that later. But you can see they quickly expanded in the 1800s, where by the mid-1850s they had reached all of the west coast that we know today of the United States. And this has very serious geopolitical implications. How did it start? I'm putting forward the idea that the nation was dominated by lawyers, bankers, and warriors. It's simple, but let's try it. Here's a quiz. What was happening in the year 1800 on the Western geopolitical landscape? Well, sure, it was the Napoleonic Wars. France had their revolution the same year that the United States had its first president, George Washington. They both went their different political ways, but actually remained fairly close friends, except for a very small war that lasted a few months. But in this era, wars don't mean so much. We'll get to that again in a little bit. By 1803, Napoleon needed a lot of money, and America wanted a lot of land. It was a perfect deal. Thomas Jefferson, as president, helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, which basically doubled the size of his country at a very low price. Napoleon, being very busy and unable to develop that land in the United States, in the Americas, also was thinking geopolitically by imagining the U.S. would use the land to control the Mississippi River completely and become a maritime rival of Great Britain, thus reducing the influence of France's great rival across the English Channel. Well, it was wonderful for the U.S. Yeah, Britain didn't like it very much, and in fact had a small war with the U.S. in 1812, called the War of 1812. I don't really know why the U.S. or Great Britain did it, and I don't think they knew why they did it either. It had something to do with France and other things. They did fight for 3 years. By 1815, they kind of said to each other, wait a minute, we are friends. We have the same language, similar culture. Let's calm down. And they did. And now, exactly 200 years later, it's been relatively smooth sailing for the two countries since then. In fact, as we will see with this map again, the United States was able to negotiate a very efficient and clean-cut treaty along the border with Canada, which was controlled by Great Britain just 3 years after the war. Things were not as smooth with Spain. You all know Spain, the grand Spanish Empire ruling the Americas for 300 years, since the time of Columbus and Pizarro and Cortez. By this time, Spain was an empire in decline. They had lost much of South America during the wars and revolutions of the Napoleonic era. And in 1819, they were quite sad. They said to themselves, "We're losing South America, and now USA is taking Florida." Well, Florida is small compared to Mexico. "Wait, Mexico, don't go!" Anyway, at least we can keep Cuba and the Philippines, right? No, Spain, I'm sorry, you cannot. America probably wanted to buy Florida from from Spain, but Spain still felt confident enough they didn't have to sell. So America fought and won in a quick war of 1819 and took Florida from Spain. But still, the Mexican holdings of Spain were vast. But Spain was unable to stop Mexico from its revolution of 1821. And Spain was effectively exiled from mainland America by the 1820s. They did have some holdings of the islands and in the Caribbean and the Pacific, but we'll talk next week about the Spanish-American War of 1898. So, Mexico now became a very strategic geopolitical concern. The timing of Mexico's independence is very significant. Roughly 50 years after that of the United States, we can consider that the development of a national identity in the U.S. had a head start over that in Mexico. And the central area of Texas, which lay between the U.S. and Mexico, became a flashpoint of contention. So, interesting case. Texas seceded from Mexico and became an independent nation with the support of U.S. bankers who influenced American citizens to migrate into the Texas territory to develop various types of commerce and agriculture. By 1836, the U.S. lawyers were able to help the American Texans establish independence in 1836. Yes, this did not make Mexico very happy, and the Mexican government's intervention into Texas, and specifically the Alamo, eventually led to the American War against Mexico in the 1840s. The Alamo is an interesting case. As a school child, I learned these kind of phrases. "Don't mess with Texas," and "Remember the Alamo," which are very interesting catchphrases because they came from a foreign country. Texas was the Republic of Texas, an independent country in the 1830s. But the idea is that American bankers and lawyers were in the process of creating something that was to become American and deserved to become American. This war with Mexico was incredible in its timing. The U.S. declared war in 1846, and you can imagine fighting against a country newly independent not so organized in the north part of its territory. The U.S. won very easily by 1848, which is a very interesting time. Possibly, do you know the term 49ers? You may have heard it before, you may not know what it means. Give me 1 minute and I will explain why America's victory in 1848 over Mexico, which gave them the lands of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, all Spanish names, is directly, coincidentally related to the 49ers. But first we should look at the idea of manifest destiny and going west. I want to do this through a couple of images. Yes, this famous painting is probably the image that I had as a young boy. Going west, romantic, exciting, wonderful. Also interesting to note, linguistically, that in 1861, the use of the word empire was celebrated in this image. In the post-World War II era, it's hard to find a supporter of the United States using the word empire to describe U.S. foreign policy. Here's a great one, American progress, represented by the liberty of women and education, spreading technology and light into a formerly dark land. Of course, you understand this formerly dark land was very happily inhabited by Indians, Mexicans, other people who had been there for hundreds of years. Probably this image is much closer to the truth of the American experience in the West. It was a hard trip that took 4 to 6 months, 8 months for families that didn't plan very well or had bad luck. The main danger for these families was not Indians or Mexicans. It was cholera and scurvy and other diseases which they had no medicine for or functional doctors to take care of them on this difficult journey. Okay, this is the image. Let's look at the policy. Why go west? Well, it has roots in an old doctrine made by this guy. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. As early as 1823, just 2 years after the independence of Mexico. It's not coincidental. 2 years after the Spanish Empire was kicked out and the only European presence in the Americas was British Canada, which I suppose the US didn't need to feel worried about. The Monroe Doctrine stated that Europe had no right to intervene in the affairs of the Americas, and in fact would be opposed by the US if they were to come to the Americas to exercise any type of domination. Imagine this, a country less than 50 years old declaring that they had effective control over the Americas. And even today, the Monroe Doctrine is cited by US policymakers when other powers want to be involved in the Americas. A catalyst for the expansion to the Americas, though, was the discovery of gold in California in 1848, the same year which concluded the Mexican-American War. Thus, after the news traveled to the east, the 49er boom, in 1849, so many people went west seeking their fortune. So it's a mix of governmental support, of encouraging people to go west, personal ambition for gold and independence, and in line with the ideas of this course, as we talked about before, if animals can migrate, they do. And people pushed the boundaries continually, expanding the population of the Americans as far as they could possibly go. How did they go west? It's an interesting geographical question. Well, if you had money, you could take comfortable route number one, go around South America. It took about 6 months by boat. It was very expensive, relatively safe, but actually going around that bottom part of South America called Cape Horn could be quite dangerous. And this led some people to take a second option. Rather than sailing that far, they could cut the time and cut some expense by going through Panama. Now, of course, we're talking about the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. There's no Panama Canal. There's no water route through Central America. So they would unload their gear on the east coast of Panama and carry it across by train or horse to the west coast of Panama and take a ship up to the west coast of the United States. However, most people who migrate, which is just as true today as it was then, were not rich people, but they were poor people or relatively poor people looking to start a new life. So they went overland, taking 7 to 8 months in a very dangerous course through the mountains of the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas. This romanticized and difficult journey by wagon train only lasted for about 20 years actually, because by the 1869, after the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and you could go from the center of the country to California by train for a relatively cheap price compared to a wagon train. This too was a geopolitical event. Now, of course, American finance, led by bankers and lawyers, was very well developed by this time. But having access to the Pacific Ocean also meant having access to cheap Chinese labor, which was instrumental in the creation of the track for the railroad. We're going to come to Asia connection in just a minute, but let's now look at what this meant for the Native Americans. There's a common expression called the Trail of Tears, which refers to the 1830s forced expulsion of Native Americans from the southeast part of the United States into the central part. While the Trail of Tears is perhaps the most famous case of driving Indians westward from the eastern part of the country, I'm going to focus on what happened to those Indians that already had lived west of the Mississippi. Remember, the Mississippi River is roughly the boundary of the original United States. After the purchase of Louisiana, there were multiple trips to explore and map the West. Interestingly, the warrior section of the United States didn't really have the capacity to dominate the Indians until a very significant event in U.S. domestic history, the Civil War. Well, my take is that the Civil War did not have such a significant impact on U.S. geopolitical history. So I'm actually going to skip over that. What the U.S. Civil War did enable was the mass mobilization of a standing army. And even though the Civil War is the bloodiest in U.S. history, with over 620,000 deaths, which is equal to nearly all of those of other U.S. involved wars combined. Despite this incredible fact, and how bloody it was, Abraham Lincoln's government expanded the wars against the Indians in the West. He had a standing army and he used it. It's incredible to know that from the year of roughly 1862, the wars against the Indians increased incredibly until basically all of the Indians were subdued by the 1890s. I don't have time or knowledge to tell you about all of the Indians, but at the least, we can pay some tribute with a visual representation. We see the Crow, Apache, Shawnee, Cherokee, Comanche, Navajo, Lakota, Mohawk, Seminole. Of course, there are so many more that I'm not putting on here. I'm just trying to represent a spectrum that ranges from the West Coast to the East Coast. But it may be interesting to look at two cases. First, the Shawnee. In this picture, represented by Tecumseh. Tecumseh is truly one of the great figures in American history. Around 1812, when the U.S. was involved in a war with Great Britain, Tecumseh thought this was the opportunity for Indians to unite and form a stance against the United States and seriously defend their land and define their land. Tecumseh did his best to unite the tribes which existed in the Ohio Valley area. Unfortunately, Indians, not well organized, not well financed, and not technologically as advanced as the United States, could not seem to become cohesive. And Tecumseh did unite some tribes, but at the same time, the United States was able to unite other tribes against Tecumseh and his forces. It was a powerful but short-lived rebellion. And Tecumseh died probably in 1815 or 1816. His people were largely massacred out of existence. The case of the Cherokee, here represented by Sequoia, took a different route. The Cherokee were part of the so-called civilized tribes existing in the southeast of the country. This is before the Trail of Tears expulsion. Sequoia and his group represented an attempt to integrate with the majority American civilization. He helped to develop an original alphabet for his people, and they established a writing system and even a constitution. So this established the attempt to join the lawyer class of the majority United States population. After 10 years of mixed success, some legal wins, in fact, the legal side of his argument was sound, and the Supreme Court of the United States supported him. However, the warrior side of the United States, represented by United States President Andrew Jackson, became stronger. And so, after the mainstream American lawyers accepted these Indians into society, it was the warrior class who expelled them outside of official U.S. territory and into the Oklahoma or Indian territory on the Trail of Tears. Whatever the options the Indians had, nothing seemed to be very successful. The U.S. also practiced ecocide. It's hard to add words to this image. I could say that the number of bison in the U.S. was probably over 10 million before 1800s. Just an absolutely dominating feature of the central part of the U.S. landscape. By the end of the 1800s, it seems the number was 1 to 2,000. This is the scale of the massacre of the bison by the majority U.S. population, encouraged by the U.S. government. The final thing to say is that the lawyers were experts at broken treaties and creating reservations for Indians to be controlled into. Please examine these two maps. The map on the left represents current Indian lands, called reservations. And if you know the geography of the U.S., you might understand that these lands tend to be somewhat undesirable in terms of agriculture and general livability. It's largely desert. If you compare this to the image on the right, which is original claims by tribes who did not have lawyers, thus the claims were completely unrespected by the mainstream United States. Final thing to say for this presentation. The American expansion, which ended at the coast of California, was very quick. Perhaps the most respected American novel is Moby Dick. Written in 1851, Herman Melville predicted Japan's opening due to whaling. The whaling industry was somewhat like the current oil industry. It was part of the world economy in terms of fuel and energy. Just like the bison, whales were massacred on an industrial scale. It's a bit hard to see in this image, but all of those barrels which are in front of those ships are full of whale oil. The sperm whale contained valuable fuel which could be burned for energy. And the United States was one of the leaders, or in fact the leader, of whaling in the 1800s. But they needed places to dock, so one of those places could have been Japan. And Herman Melville predicted that the bankers were going to be the ones responsible for the opening of Japan. He wasn't completely wrong. 2 years after the publication of this book, the U.S. succeeded in opening Japan. And now this was the third try. This third try represented the tipping of the balance between U.S. political, economic, and legal dominance and Japan's relative weakening of their government. Please note the timing. This is just 5 or 6 years after the U.S. was able to reach the west coast of California. I mean, California hadn't even become a state until 1850. The U.S. wasted no time in their expansion into Asia. In fact, just before the U.S. Civil War, U.S. played a small part in helping Great Britain subdue Chinese resistance in the Second Opium War. You might argue that the real reason for opening Japan was to obtain access to China. I'm arguing with this course that really China has been instrumental in very many U.S. policy decisions throughout history. Even before the Civil War, the U.S. knew that good relations with China would be critical to its dominance of both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. We're skipping ahead now, but after the Indian Wars had been completed, the U.S. was ready to play more of an international role. As I mentioned, there was the Spanish-American War at the end of the century, which we'll talk about next week. Very briefly, the U.S. was keen to be part of an international force to put down the Boxer Rebellion at the end of the century. Again, this is dominated by the British, but the U.S. wanted to be a part of what was happening in China at this time. And finally, to take us just before World War I, the U.S. invested much of their time, energy, and legal power into creating the Panama Canal. This was initiated under Theodore Roosevelt, the president. Just look at this map and remember that the U.S. in the past had to go down around South America to get to the Pacific Ocean from the East Coast. Now, with the opening of the Panama Canal, ports in New York and Baltimore and Atlanta and Miami could easily access the markets of Asia. And this is still significant in 2015, as Panama is currently expanding the canal to handle even larger ships for even more transactions between, for example, the U.S. East Coast and the Chinese and Asian markets. What I'm saying is, what began as a fight against Britain for small territory expanded into the buying of territory from France, the fighting for territory from Spain and Mexico, the absolute robbery of territory from the Indians, is part of a continual cycle of American expansion which is headed for Asia. And in some future courses, we will return to that theme. Thank you very much.